Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. So we're in a series right now on emotional maturity and how it's essential to discipleship. We believe that Jesus had more EQ, or emotional intelligence, than any other person that has ever walked the planet, and consistently embodied emotional intelligence. And so, if we're going to grow as disciples of Jesus, we must grow in our emotional intelligence as well. So today we had a great discussion on an important component, which is social awareness. So I'm curious, you guys, what stood out from our convo today?
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me was when we talked about how emotional intelligence, particularly social awareness, can be described as the ability to kind of read the tone of the room. And Josiah, you pointed out that, what we're going for is not someone who can read a room and understand other people solely for the purpose of benefiting themselves, right? Like a person who walks into an organization and says, all right, who's got all the power and the influence here so that I can sort of suck up to them and get ahead. It's being attuned to other people for the purpose of being for their good and for connecting with them and getting compassionately curious to what's going on inside them.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the things that stood out from our conversation for me was how when we fail to be appropriately attuned to other people, often it's because of our own self-absorption. And as I'm kind of reflecting on our conversation, I just think there's some opportunity for me, especially at home, to sort of push back on some of my own lack of awareness in order to be, more of a cruciform presence at home that's attentive to other people and their needs.
Yeah, we talk about in our effort to be attuned to the emotions and thoughts and interactions with other people, we can either become over-attuned or under-attuned. And I would have considered myself as someone who is over-attuned. But as we were talking about it, I had moments and flashbacks of plenty of times where I am under-attuned as well. So lots of growth for all of us in this, right?
Yeah.
Well, cool. Let's get into it. Here is our conversation on social awareness.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Katie.
I am Mac.
And I'm Josiah.
All right, so we are pretty solidly into summer, right? We're right at the end of June as we're recording this. And one thing I was thinking about that I love about summer is I give myself way more permission to eat ice cream. I know last episode, Mac, you were talking about your love for coffee ice cream with Heath.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how many awesome places we have here in town to get ice cream. And not just ice cream, like there's gelato, there's custard. So I have a question for you two. What is your favorite local ice cream type place?
I would say for me, it's close to our home, is Mullins. Like there's something about going to Mullins and then kind of the boardwalk right there, the tables. I like it.
It's the atmosphere for you.
It's the atmosphere.
Going up to the
and the ice
counter.
cream's great,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do wish they had a way to sit-down area, too.
Yes. Okay, so not to hog the space, but the other place I really like is Dairy Queen. They have what I call a pergonope. It's like a pergola / canopy that I've dubbed pergonope. And there's something classic about Dairy Queen and then just sitting under the pergonope with people I enjoy.
As you said that, I just had a memory of doing a meeting in the pergonope.
Underneath the pergonope.
Underneath the pergonope, planning for the podcast.
Yes.
Last summer on my birthday.
Yeah.
I think it was
Me,
on
you,
my
and
birthday.
Adam.
That's true.
Yeah, me, you, and Adam.
Yeah.
A dipped cone. I was eating a dipped cone talking about this podcast underneath the pergonope.
Yeah.
If you guys had a dilly bar from Dairy Queen.
A what?
When I was a
A dilly
kid.
bar.
No.
That's like their classic.
Yeah, you're missing out.
Oh, you have to get a dilly bar.
Cherry-dipped dilly bar.
Okay.
Ooh.
Although they've definitely shrunk them in size over time, I've been told.
Shrinkflation.
Yeah. I will say, for me, I like specialty ice cream, but my go-to, if I'm ever craving ice cream, is a butterscotch dipped cone from Dairy Queen.
Aren't the dip cones are the best.
If I'm ever on vacation and I'm like not eating healthy, a Dairy Queen butterscotch dip is the thing I crave every single time.
Mine,
Something about just vanilla soft serve is probably still my favorite ice cream.
my immediate next door neighbor manages the Dairy Queen.
Really?
Yes.
Do you ever get free stuff?
Yes.
Any perks?
Yeah, there's been a few times where they've had like power outages or whatever, and in order to like salvage the cakes, ice cream cakes, she'll be like, "Hey, I just got a couple ice cream cakes. Do you want them?" And we'll throw them in our deep freeze and pull them out. It's awesome.
Hook us up next time.
Yeah,
I think mine would be Kilty. Like I just love going to the Kilty. I went there a lot as a kid, and
Sure.
I love the flurries, like a chocolate flurry with the Oreos in it. It's like my favorite. I'm already thinking about this year, a month from now, for my birthday. I'm going to go to the Kilty, get a hamburger and a chocolate flurry.
Do you experience really long wait times when you go to the Kilty? I feel like it's a mess when you go there.
Sometimes. Depends
Yeah.
how busy it is. If you go on car night, where there's hundreds of old cars,
Oh, I don't know.
I would never
don't
do
go
that.
on that night.
There'd be zero reason for me to ever go.
Well, that was a great question, Katie. Let's jump into this. We are in a series right now on emotional maturity, where we're looking at 4 components that comprise emotional intelligence. And I think, one of the things that makes what we're doing a little bit unique here is that we're attempting to do this while keeping our eyes on Jesus. So we're kind of looking to Jesus as our ultimate example of how to embody these things. The 4 components are self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relational management. And today we're going to discuss all things social awareness. So let's start by defining what it is we're even talking about. What is social awareness? What comes to mind when we use that phrase?
So one definition I found was social awareness refers to the ability to perceive, understand, and consider the perspectives, needs, and behaviors of other people. So I think when we're talking about, being self-aware, we've talked about kind of managing ourselves because of or in spite of our emotions. And now we're kind of adding a layer of complexity to that. We're talking about being attuned to the emotions of other people. Anything you'd add, Josiah?
Yeah. We learned about emotional intelligence in my intro to psychology class recently. And anytime we talked about social awareness, it was always it was always sort of taught in congruence with empathy, that empathy is sort of goes along with it. And I will say that social awareness is probably the place where you can't necessarily fake your empathy for people. I think that there are elements like in my own life I can fake that I'm as self-aware as maybe I'm not. I can sort of fake the way I show up in the room, right? We talked last week about being able to, I can sort of construct my life in such a way that nothing ever goes wrong, so that I don't ever have to deal with that, with how I am regulating my own emotions, and I can sort of fake it. But I think social awareness, when you talk about cultivating empathy for others and being able to perspective take and understand what someone else is going through, I don't think you can fake it. I think that's sort of where you have to cultivate a genuine desire to actually care about people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think, where my brain goes is like the extreme examples of people who lack empathy, like serial killers and there are these extreme examples of this is what happens when you have no empathy.
You guys both watch The Office, right?
Yes.
You know the character Todd Packer?
Yes.
Okay. He, in my mind, is like an extreme example of lacking all social awareness whatsoever.
Totally inappropriate.
Right? Walks into the room, says the most inappropriate, offensive, insensitive, crude things, and demonstrates a real lack of what we're going for here.
Yes.
Yeah. As we define what social awareness is, one thing I would want to highlight, and you were alluding to this, Katie, is just this is complex. We're adding to self-awareness and self-regulation this whole other component that now involves other people. Mm-hmm. And I just want to name, that's hard work. It's hard work to be attuned to other people as well as attuned to yourself simultaneously. And what occurs to me is that right off the bat, we realize this isn't something we just like arrive at. It's not like you master this and then move on. With all of these components, this is like a lifelong journey. I can think of examples just this week where I'm having to think through like my own like self-awareness, self-regulation. How did I show up? How was I present? And how attuned was I to the people around me in these moments? Mm-hmm. It's complex, and I just want to name that. There's a lot going on here, and it's not a one and done. It's kind of a lifelong journey.
Yeah, it definitely is. A quick example of social awareness on the daily, and just like a common place. Just yesterday, I was taking my kids to swim lessons, and my oldest daughter, was next to me in the seat. And I could have just driven to swim lessons. We were in a hurry. We were trying to get from one place to another. And it'd be very easy to just go drop them off at swim lessons and pay no attention to how the other people around me in the car are feeling. But as we were arriving, I noticed some of her body language that seemed tense. She was sort of breathing heavy, and she was looking out the window in a way that looked like she was frustrated. Her facial expression seemed like her eyebrows were sort of furrowed. And so I just say, "Hey, are you doing okay? So is everything okay?" Essentially. And I wouldn't have had to stop and do that, but the ability to just do that on a daily basis is sort of, I think maybe that casts vision for what it could look like in a very normal practice. To just be aware of what's happening around you, and the ability to perceive that, and then taking the time to empathetically respond.
Yeah, to be present. Way to go, Dad.
Yeah. It didn't really work. She didn't tell me.
But
I could tell. Yeah. She just said, I was like, is everything okay? And I said, "You just seem tense." And she's like, "Yeah, I'm always tense." I was like, "Well, is there something you're worried about? Is something on your mind?" She's like, "Yeah, everything." And that's all I got out of her, really. But it did. She did sort of relax after that, and then. But
how old is she?
She is 11, but
going on 18.
Oh yeah,
Awesome.
You would think she's a teenager.
That's
for sure.
Well, you tried.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been doing with the other aspects of emotional intelligence has been sort of comparing what it is and what it isn't. And some of these traits that we're talking about sort of have like when it's present and when it's not. And so what's the difference between someone who has it and someone who doesn't? I know we already started this, but what are some of those other ways? Some of those characteristics that someone has when they have a high degree of social awareness, and something that's present when they're not?
It's a great question.
Yeah, I think on a big level, these people are just able to read a room, right? That's the phrase that comes to my mind. They can do that with groups of people. They can do that with individuals.
Like, are you talking about decorations? Like, whoa, they can read this room. Like, this is what would make this room look great. Or are you talking about
they might be able to do that.
Okay.
But I am talking about reading the social cues or the people in the room. Like, I think about the times in my life I've started a new job. My social awareness antenna kind of goes into overdrive. Like, I'm constantly, every new meeting I'm stepping into, every person I meet, I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the social environment that I've just stepped into? What are the different roles and personalities? How do I fit in here? What do people talk about? How formal is it? How informal is it? Like, I'm constantly trying to read the room. But there's a lot that goes into reading a room. So perhaps we can, open it up to another layer and go, well, what would you guys say goes into that?
Yeah. Well, and I think you're on it. Like, reading the room is super important, and we've all experienced people who can't read a room. Like you mentioned the show The Office. And of course, Todd Packer is, a great example of someone who isn't reading the room well. But like, this is what Michael Scott is what makes that show brilliant and awkward and cringeworthy, because he is unable to read the social cues around him. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's cringeworthy at times. And I'm sure we've all experienced people who are somewhat like that. I remember I once worked with someone who I think had a pretty horrendous case of Michael Scott syndrome. Not very aware of how other people were experiencing those relational interactions. One default this person had is they just talked a lot, like more than anybody else. And I remember being really frustrated with that at times because it would just like take up all of the space. And I remember talking to my therapist about one time. She's like, well, we'll just turn it into a game. Like, instead of being so frustrated about it, why don't you just sit and see how long you can go without saying anything and see how long it goes? It ended up being like 2 hours, you guys.
Oh my gosh.
Where like I literally didn't need to contribute anything for that space to continue to exist. But so my point is that, you know, there is the Michael Scott syndrome where people are just wildly out of touch with the environments they inhabit and how other people are experiencing them. If we had to drill down a little bit, one of the things I would name like a characteristic that contributes to social awareness is compassionate curiosity. It seems to me that those who are able to sort of read a room, lean in, and are genuinely interested. Going to your point, Josiah, about authenticity, you can't fake it. They're like genuinely curious and interested in the people around them. They're wanting to know how other people think about things, how they're making sense of things, their frames. They're wanting to know how other people feel or experience, you know, various things, and they lean in and ask questions to get after that. Whereas those without it really don't take an interest in other people. They aren't curious about how someone else might be feeling or how they make sense of things. In some cases, they might think they have a read on people, but it's sort of this presumptive arrogance where they aren't actually curious. They're just kind of like telling other people what's going on in their lives, which is totally different than leaning in with curiosity and wondering about it together. So what would you guys say about that? I'm kind of throwing out there compassionate curiosity leads to genuine interest in other people, and those without it are sort of self-absorbed and have no curiosity with regard to the people around them.
Yeah, well, Josiah, I think that's what you demonstrated with your daughter, right? And it didn't really necessarily result in her opening up a whole lot, but we can't control that. Like, I think you were present to her with compassionate curiosity. And I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I think you actually have to care. I don't know. If you reduce it down to the key element of compassionate curiosity, there is a skill involved, obviously, like knowing how to like ask good questions and dig below the surface and all of that. But it does take actually caring about the person next to you. Mm-hmm. And even to your point, Katie, when you talked about the big picture being able to read a room, well, there are times when reading the room is more for your benefit than it is for theirs, right? So like I could use it to sort of get ahead at the organization I'm going in. I can figure out how to play the politics game because I know how to read this situation right in order to turn that towards what it looks like to follow Jesus with this. I think that it just takes cultivating sort of, I don't know, reckoning with the fact that if I don't care about how anyone else feels in the room, well, that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to fake it, it's obvious. Okay, funny story. This was back when we had young kids, okay? And I think we had a new infant. And Josie got mastitis, which is a breast infection from breastfeeding. Like most moms probably experience that at some point. And this coworker walks in and is like, hey, how are things going? And I'm like, well, it was kind of a rough weekend. You know, Josie got mastitis, and so she's not feeling the best and so on. And he goes, well, yeah, I hear that's been going around. And it's like, what? So it's just like an example of like, yeah, you're not genuinely present. You know what I mean? Like you clearly have no clue what this means. You've heard this is going, like it's just disingenuous.
Yeah, so you're using these sort of sayings that people use to make it seem like they're socially aware of what's going on, but they're just using it.
Yes.
Yeah, or I think of a politician who can really turn it on, you know, like sort of in a way fake the, oh yeah, I totally understand, in order to manufacture a connection for the purpose of getting you to like me, support me, vote for me. That's very different than being truly compassionately curious about what's going on in someone's life for their own benefit, not just for your benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that compassionate curiosity keeps the room reading part of this from becoming assumptive,
Yeah.
So I can, if you're acting in a certain way, I may read what's going on and I'll assume I know what's going on and then bypass the curiosity part and just treat you as if this thing I'm assuming is going on with you.
It's almost as if curiosity is what grounds it with authenticity and integrity.
Yeah.
If I'm genuinely curious, I'm not assuming and I'm not pretending, I'm leaning in honestly. What else would you guys name filling out this question, Katie, you asked around, are you guys, how does this look? If we break it down from like reading the room to like what components actually allow someone to read the room, what else would you guys say?
I think one that goes right along with what you were just saying, Mac, is perspective taking. So the ability to put myself in someone else's shoes. This has a couple of parts to it. There's the cognitive part of it. So even if I'm not necessarily feeling empathetic towards someone enough to sit in their shoes, I can consciously in my mind try to think about where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. I think that it's important to note that this is a skill that I can practice well ahead of time. I can choose to perspective take well before I'm in a conversation with someone, well before I walk into the room. I think this is also a great tool to use, taking the perspective of others as a way of diffusing situations maybe in my workplace or people in my life that I have animosity towards. I think that it can help if there's tension maybe with like someone else going on in my life and I'm preparing maybe for a conversation that's going to be sort of high stakes. Mm-hmm. Perspective taking is a great way to show up in an emotionally mature way in order to do that well.
Feels so relevant. We have a racial peacemaking kingdom community at our church. It's a group of people who come together periodically, and I'm part of it. Katie's part of it. Our desire as a group is to be bridge builders as an extension of the gospel, like where there's a racial fractures and divides. We want to be part of God's healing work in the world. And it just occurs to me that part of the way that I orient to this conversation has been leaning in and trying to understand the experiences and the perspectives of racial minorities in the world. Like that's been huge for me to understand where people are coming from and perhaps the extent of this problem. And even if we zoom out from the racial tensions that exist in our country and just think of all the polarizing topics that are dividing people, it seems like we're slowly losing our capacity to perspective take. Like how much good work would happen if people had enough maturity to lean in on all these various topics that are legitimately contentious and so on, but did the hard work of perspective taking to understand how maybe someone who votes differently or whatever makes sense of that issue. We might realize we actually have more in common than we realize. And I might learn and grow from the perspective of someone else in a way that I'm currently not because I'm not willing to go there.
Totally. I think that's a really insightful observation. And we'll never do it perfectly, right? My thoughts and opinions are shaped by my experiences, but I can certainly try, and I can use what is available to me and get curious to kind of make a step towards that. Yeah, I think related to that, Josiah would say empathy. Empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share with the feelings of others. So this is obviously tied closely to social awareness. But if social awareness is the ability to perceive what people are thinking and feeling, empathy, I would say, is the ability to enter into that with them. So it makes me think of this video. I think both of you know what I'm talking about. There's a little Brene Brown video where she talks about empathy and she contrasts it to sympathy.
Yeah.
And there's two characters, little cartoon characters, and one falls in a hole. And in the sympathy video, the other person stands at the top of the hole and looks down and says, "I'm so sorry you're down there. Like, I feel so sorry for you."
Want me to make you a sandwich?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
That's what it
she does say that.
Yeah. And in the empathy video, the person falls in a hole and the other person climbs down there and says, "I'm so sorry you fell. Like, yep, it sure is dark down here. I understand why you're scared." And I think there's a lot to that. I think empathy requires drawing on our own experiences and our own kind of emotional memories or reserves in order to kind of have solidarity with the person and to relate to them. Not in a way that's overly enmeshed or codependent or lacks boundaries, but it looks like validating what someone is feeling in kind of an open-minded and non-judgmental way.
Yeah, and I hear that connecting to what Mac was saying, that if you lack empathy, what should you do about it, right? Like, I can't pretend I have empathy. Maybe there's an element of faking it till I make it. You know what I mean? Like pretending I care. But I think the idea of perspective taking, the ability to sit down and say, okay, how might this person be experiencing this in my brain, sometimes can help lead to an emotional connection of empathy. And I think, this is just personally, Jesus calls us, it's not, I know Jesus calls us to love our enemies. I'm not saying that I think that. Jesus said we should love our enemies. Well, how else are we able to love our enemies if we can't cultivate empathy for people who are different than us? So it may take work. But it's a spiritual work.
Yeah.
It's a work of discipleship and spiritual formation to get to the place where I can be empathetic towards someone else, especially when they're different than me.
Yeah, I think empathy requires proximity, like, right? Going back to your Brene Brown video, like sympathy is standing at the top, and it's not getting down into the pit with the person. You're standing at a distance. Empathy requires getting proximate to the person, coming alongside, entering in. And it seems to me when Jesus says, love your enemies, that's not just like an abstract idea that you can do from a distance. As we get proximate to those that are quote unquote enemies, our perspective of them actually is genuinely transformed from enemy to fellow image bearer, brother, sister, etc. Right?
Yeah.
There's like reconciliation that happens as we become proximate. And empathy is a key ingredient of that. That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
That's great. So in each of these episodes of this series, we've talked about how we see Jesus embodying these different skills in the Gospels, right? We've done that with self-awareness, self-regulation, and now social awareness. Where would you guys say we see Jesus being attuned to the emotions, perspectives, et cetera, of other people?
So I did what you're not supposed to do when reading the Bible. I tell people if you're going to read the Bible, don't just like start paging through it and then stick your finger in and then read wherever you sort of landed. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. But as a fun experiment, I opened up to like Matthew and then created like a little gap from Matthew to the end of John. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to assume Jesus demonstrates social awareness on every page of the Gospels. Let me just like kind of flip through and then put my finger in and see where it stops. It stopped at Luke 7. And there were two stories in Luke 7 where I think that captures Jesus's social awareness. One is when in Luke 7, he raises a widow's son. So he's traveling with his disciples. They're approaching this village or town called Nain. And as they're approaching, there's like this funeral processional that's happening. And they discover it's this widow who has lost her only son. And so notice she's a widow, which means she's already lost her husband. And now this is her only son. And in that culture, women didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to like provide for themselves. So she's in a really vulnerable place. And the text says Jesus saw her. I love that phrase. He saw her. And then he moves towards her and comforts her and then ends up raising her son back to life. It's just this beautiful picture of like Jesus entering in, feeling what she's feeling, like genuinely being present to her, and then allowing the kingdom of God to break in and make something new, to repair what's been broken or what's been lost. Okay, then you keep going in Luke 7. And there's a story where Jesus has a meal at a Pharisee's house named Simon. And while they're eating, this sinful, quote unquote, sinful woman comes in and starts like anointing his feet and crying and carrying on and like this kind of like this grand gesture of gratitude and thanksgiving for the forgiveness she's received and all this stuff. And Jesus allows her to do this, which would have been a little bit scandalous. And so he's in tune with this woman. and like her gratitude and kind of where she's at. But he's also in tune with the fact that this Pharisee named Simon is totally being judgmental of this woman. So he begins to draw attention to Simon's judgmentalism. And it's kind of like, yeah, who's been forgiven more? And kind of like goes on this narration of like, hey, you didn't wash my feet, but she's washed my feet with her tears. You didn't give me oil for my head. She put perfume on my feet. And he keeps going. It's just this masterful demonstration of social awareness where he's in tune with the gratitude and forgiveness this woman has been experiencing and sort of the self-righteous arrogance and hypocrisy of Simon. And he's able to draw attention to both. So that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, and as you narrate that, it seems like he did that in a compassionately curious way, right? Like he didn't just call out Simon.
No, he's inviting Simon in. He's inviting Simon into the same place that this woman is, a place of gratitude and thanksgiving at the forgiveness and grace of God.
Yeah. Think about that. That situation is a very complex one socially because he's aware of what the Pharisees must be thinking and the people who are there. He's aware that this woman is very genuine, and if he was only attuned to just one of those situations, he may have deemed that, oh, this is very inappropriate. Like, you can come back later. I'll talk to you later outside of here. We'll have a private conversation. But he was attuned to the fact, like, how genuine this woman was being. And
this was probably
a very formative moment for her.
Yeah.
To just reject that because it's not the right social setting. But also realizing that this isn't the right social setting. These guys are probably thinking quite a bit of things.
Yep.
You know, I also think about how many times throughout Scripture in the Gospels you hear you see the words like Jesus knowing their thoughts, or he was moved with compassion, and then he would heal people, right? So anyway, it's just interesting when you think about it that way, how complex that situation was and how he waded into all of it.
Yeah, and I don't know this for sure, but I'll just throw this out there as like my hypothesis. When it says Jesus knowing their thoughts, for example, there's this moment where he heals like the paralytic or the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath. And of course, this creates like a negative reaction from the religious leaders in that moment. And then it says Jesus knowing their thoughts, then begins to speak to those thoughts. You know, maybe sometimes I think it's one angle might be he's omniscient, so he knows all. And that's why he knows their thoughts. But perhaps another theory is that, no, he's just socially attuned. Like, what they're thinking is written all over their faces in that moment. It's not like some, divine omniscience that Jesus is like acting or pivoting out of. It's just the fact that he's socially aware of how they're internalizing this moment, and it's written all over their faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, another one that came to mind for me was Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well, right? There's a story of Jesus passing through Samaria. He ends up at a well with a Samaritan woman. He begins a conversation with her, which is surprising because normally Jews and Samaritans would not have interacted due to their cultural and religious differences. But in this case, he engages in a conversation with her that demonstrates a high degree of attunement to what she's thinking and feeling. Like, he names some areas that seem to be causing her to feel shame. And he also acknowledges her desire for forgiveness and for a new way of life. And I think he does it in a really compassionately curious way.
Yeah, I think some people read that passage as Jesus is like not letting her off the hook, like he's kind of exposing these things. And I actually see, like, as you're naming, I see him like drawing attention to these things that carry great shame for her and like bringing them out into the light so they can be transformed by his grace and love. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
Which should probably be, maybe that's a good checkpoint for all of us when we see someone else caught in sin, right? Is to realize, like, what is the point in calling it out? If it isn't to bring it to light with an effort to be for this person and perspective take a little bit, like, what does it look like to genuinely help this person? Am I calling out sin to relieve my own anxiety about someone in my life who's doing something wrong?
Or to prop myself up.
or to make myself feel better, or am I genuinely concerned about this person? And I think that completely changes your posture.
Yes.
And how you show up.
100%. So we're talking about social awareness, and it's complex. It's hard when you're reading the room. Sometimes it's hard to get it right. And I know as a staff team, we often talk about two common pitfalls, that we can fall into when it comes to social awareness. One being under attuned, another one being overly attuned. So let's just fill that out for our listeners. Josiah, what would you say about being under attuned?
Well, I would say that in general, being under attuned would mean you're self-absorbed. That you care more about how you are feeling or thinking than you do care about how others are thinking and feeling. And that can look like a variety of things, but I even think about the example of reading a room. If I were to walk into, let's just say, staff meeting, for instance, I walk into staff meeting and all I can think about and observe is how I'm feeling in that moment.
How you did in your CrossFit workout that day.
Sure. or how I'm feeling about something else happening in my personal life, or maybe my thoughts are on something else. And I walk in and I sit down at the table. I'm probably not doing a lot of reading body language. I'm not trying to get a sense of how someone else is doing. All I can think about is myself.
Yeah, you have no clue that Adam's about to cry.
No idea.
No idea.
I don't think Adam does either.
Might be true.
Yeah, no, I hear you going, hey, part of under attunement, what contributes to that is when we're just totally absorbed by whatever's going on with us. How can we be present to other people when we're only present to ourselves?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the reverse, like there's another side to this where we can actually lose ourselves in being attuned to other people, right?
Yeah, so this we would describe as being overly attuned. And I would just say that is when we prioritize connection, like connection to other people so much that we lose the ability to define ourselves. So something that came to mind as I was preparing for this was Gumby. You guys remember the little green Gumby guy?
I remember the image of Gumby.
Yeah,
You're giving me a blank stare, Mac.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Josiah. Like, I know what you're talking about, but I have no specific memories attached to that character.
The actual show. Or
He's like a green rubbery guy.
Cool.
And when I think of over attunement, I think of like Gumby, who bends and contorts so much that he like loses his true shape. See where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I do. Now it's all making sense.
And maybe we can put an image of
Great
Gumby
analogy.
in the podcast notes.
Adam, can you put Gumby in the show notes, please?
Sure thing. Didn't he have a horse too? Was there a horse?
Yeah, he rode a horse.
Was the horse flexible and like stretchy too? Or?
Good question. I don't know.
All right. Adam, can we put that in the show notes?
So I think, when I think about my past, like kind of, I don't know, high school, early college, adulthood, I think this was probably the ditch that I defaulted towards. If I thought someone was like upset with me or mad at me, like it killed me. Like I couldn't just sort of move on. I would lose sleep over it. And oftentimes I think I would avoid sharing how I felt or my opinions or preferences. I know you guys probably find this hard to believe now. But I would go into overdrive trying to ascertain what people around me were thinking about me. And that becomes sort of exhausting. And I think what I've learned as I've stepped into growth in this area is that it's not my job to manage other people's emotions. It is my job to be attuned and to be compassionately curious, but it's not my job to fix or to manage. And I've also learned that I think there's a level of trust that's required of me in relationships, right? Like, Mac, if I'm sensing that you're seeming sort of cold or distant or upset with me, and I say, hey, here's kind of what I'm observing. Is there something going on? Is there some tension? And you say, nope, I'm totally fine. We're good. Like, I have to trust you with that. I have to take you at your word and trust that, well, if you are feeling that you're not actually something that you're not actually saying, well, then that's kind of on you. And hopefully you'll bring it to me. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or I'm just pretending to be mad at you to see how much sleep you lose. I'm just joking. I think, under attuned, over attuned. This is stuff that we will have to wrestle with for as long as we're alive. I mean, as I just reflect on this week, you guys, I can think of moments where I wasn't attuned enough the way I'd want to be. I was too self-absorbed or thinking about this rather than being present to this person in the way that I could have been. And I also think of many moments where, like Katie, like you're narrating, where I can become so attuned to someone else and what they might be feeling that I begin to lose myself in trying to manage that. Mm-hmm. And I can think of historical moments. I once worked with someone who was really hot and cold, really moody, and they had a lot of power in our workplace. And so everybody would just kind of like determine, ooh, are they having a good day or a bad day? And sort of read that person's emotional state and then adjust, then adjust to how they're doing. If they're not doing well, if they're moody, well, I'll just kind of avoid any, or if they're good, well, then that's a day where we can talk about a lot of things and be super playful. And at the heart of that, kind of what you were getting at, is a lack of differentiation. I'm letting the other person's emotional state determine how I'm being present. And that's a result of being overly attuned.
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of, that's so true. Even as I was giving the example of walking into staff meeting and only noticing how I'm feeling in the room and not taking the time to think of others, I can think of a dozen times when I've done that myself. As I was saying it, I was like, oh, I think I've done that plenty. But I also struggle, especially when emotions are really high. So if you're in a conversation with someone, they're expressing their how they're feeling in a very dramatic way. It's sometimes difficult for me to determine how I'm feeling when, like, in the face of how they're feeling. So I found this when people are closer to me and I care about them more, that when they're clearly distraught and something's really wrong, well, I may assume that I feel the same way because I'm empathizing. Mm. And maybe I'll change some of my own convictions on something because of how emotions are high. I can think of instances when that has happened with me. And so there is a struggle in those moments for me to be able to walk out of those and try to determine what's me and what's someone else. It all just gets mixed
jumbled together.
Yes.
Yeah. And what I hear you describing is maintaining definition and connection at the same time.
Yeah.
And you not wanting to sacrifice one without the other. We use empathy to connect with people and perspective take, but yet also we want to stay in tune with ourselves and what's going on inside and self-defined within that space.
Yeah. So as we start to land the plane here, what are some ways that someone listening to this could grow in their social awareness?
Yeah, one practice would be learning how to ask good questions. Again, thinking about Jesus, Jesus asked 307 questions in the Gospels. He was like a master at asking questions. And so if you're going to learn how to be present to people the way Jesus was present to people, you're going to want to learn how to ask really good questions that get at the heart of things. And I would want to say these aren't leading questions. There's a way of asking questions where you're sort of leading someone to a predetermined conclusion that you already have. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about open-ended questions where you're genuinely curious, kind of going back to that compassionate curiosity thing, genuinely curious and wanting to discover more about the other person, right?
Yeah, and maybe hand in hand with that is just reflecting back. So like the active listening part, and then also like reflecting back what you're hearing the person say.
Yes.
Maybe another one I would add.
Right. So I hear you saying ask good questions. And then secondly, a second practice is practice summarizing what you hear other people saying. Mm-hmm. In those moments where you're asking questions, or maybe in a work situation that's complex and there's different perspectives, right? A conflict. Practice summarizing what you hear other people saying as an embodied demonstration of perspective taking.
Yeah, I think it helps you take on that perspective. And I think it can also help the person bring clarity. I know I can think of many examples where I've been processing something or going through something and having someone just actively listen, but then also reflect back and say, so I think what I hear you saying is this. It sort of brings more clarity myself. I can go, yeah, that is how I'm feeling. And it adds some more awareness around it.
Yeah, or you may be wrong.
Yeah,
right.
It might expose that you didn't hear right.
They might just say, that's not what I'm trying to say at all.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, okay.
Well, then tell me again.
Let's go back a step.
Right.
Yeah, it has a way of slowing down the conversation and not rushing to conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
that is a practice that builds our capacity to empathize.
Okay, this one feels super important for those who are listening that have marriages.
Yeah.
That when because we all have moments in our marriages where, you're not on the same page, and learning how to communicate is just really important. And I think sometimes there might be, as Josie and I, have practiced this at times, it feels sort of like elementary and, you know what I mean, unnecessary to go, no, well, I heard you saying. But like when we do it and try to do it naturally, I can't tell you how helpful it is.
Yeah.
Like, this is the substance of what I hear you saying. And then I say it in my own words, yes or no. And if no, then we need to like circle back, as you're naming, Josiah, and begin to move closer to understanding one another.
Yeah, another one would be learning to observe body language and tone of voice. People are giving cues all the time to how they're thinking and feeling. Mm-hmm. And although it's not your job to be an empath in which you can just like sort of unconsciously know what everyone's thinking and feeling, the act of taking the time to observe. I know the example I gave earlier about my daughter on the way to swim lessons is simple, but taking the time to practice looking around you. I mean, like, I'm wondering, like, if I just observe them as they sit there in this chair, what am I observing? And doing that allows us to, again, it allows us to build our capacity to empathize.
I feel like at one point I may have Googled or been given a link to an assessment where it has like a bunch of pictures or faces of people having different emotions. And then it was like multiple choice. So you had to kind of pick. And the goal of the assessment was just kind of give you a baseline of your ability to pick up nonverbal nuances. So I don't know. I don't have like a link to give people, but if you want a baseline, I'm sure there's something out there where you can go, hey, do I have where am I at as a starting point, right?
Yeah.
But then I think what I also heard you, and you did this with your daughter, it's not like you're being overly certain in your interpretation of someone's nonverbals or tone of voice. You're sort of bringing them to that, to ask questions about it. Hey, I'm picking up on this. You shared an example of that too. I'm picking up on this. Is that right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like there's a sense of humility in what you're observing. It's not like you have perfect perception.
Yeah. This makes me think of, remember last week I talked about last time we talked about the autonomic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
If you think that you're not reading people's facial expressions and tones of voice, you're very wrong. Your brain is doing it all the time. So some of this comes back to self-awareness and sort of interrupting those automatic processes that are happening in the background in our lives. We have to interrupt that to say, okay, we're always observing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Your brain is constantly trying to observe threat.
Maybe not to the level of an Enneagram 3.
Yeah, you're on. Right.
I think there are other numbers that would probably like to give you a run for your money, but it's true. My point is that it's always happening.
Mm-hmm.
You are probably responding to that.
For sure.
Those observations, whether you realize it or not.
Dude, when I'm preaching a sermon, I find a few people in the audience that like appear engaged.
Yeah.
And I kind of circle back to those people to keep me going. Mm-hmm. There's a couple people who I've misread at times because they just look angry while you're speaking, and I've discovered they're just thinking.
Their concentrating face is
yes, their concentrating face looks like they're mad about what you're saying.
But even think about a family dynamic. You go home for Christmas or Easter or some sort of holiday, and you're in the room, and what happens when things feel tense, or maybe someone says something, right? That someone says something that's a little controversial. Just look around the room and see people's body language. I just observed this somewhat recently. A conversation got a little tense in a family dynamic, and I watched one of the people literally just got up and walked away. They said, basically like, I'm done.
I'm out.
I don't want to be a part of this. So if you look around and start to observe, you will realize like there are a lot of cues.
Yes.
And then you apply that by being compassionately curious rather than just reactive to either I'm going to shy away, I'm going to walk away, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to like engage and try to win this argument, right? Mm-hmm. So learning to observe, realizing that we already do it.
So we've named a few practices: learn to ask good questions, practice active listening, observe body language and tone of voice. Maybe one more would be to put yourself in their shoes, right? Especially when you're having a crucial conversation or some sort of conflict. Oftentimes we are so intent on just making our perspective known or sort of proving our point, when we can slow down and actually think about how someone else might be thinking or feeling. It can really open up space for shared understanding. I even think about my son, Griffin, who has Down syndrome. And this is a work we have to constantly do with our two older boys because they can easily get frustrated with him. And we're constantly reminding them, like, you're assuming he has the same degree of awareness that you do, and he doesn't.
Yeah.
And when you sort of meet him at where he is and consider what his perspective, his abilities, it totally changes the way we orient to him, right?
Yeah. I heard someone say this on a podcast once, and I am blanking at who said it. But they talked about how if you take the time and you're frustrated about something, you could take it about a situation or a person. Mm-hmm. And you take the time to write down at least 3 factors that are influencing how this person is behaving. It's exactly what we're talking about, but it was a little more systematic. It was like a process. But just take the time to write down 3 things of what could be influencing this person to be behaving in the way they are. It could be, well, they're in this stage of life. I think of my kids. My daughter's 11. Although her friend drama can seem silly to me, to her, the drama she experiences in her friend groups is very real. And figuring out her place in the world and how to fit in as a 5th grader in a new school, all those things are factors that play into how regulated she's able to be.
Totally.
So if I take the time to just write down a few of those things, I can do that. I can do that ahead of time. I don't have to wait till the moment to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hear you saying it informs how you interact with them. It doesn't totally justify it. Like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to drop this because this person, I understand now why they're feeling this way or upset, but it informs how you press in.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe another one is adaptability. So I'm guessing for, when we do practice social awareness, if we walk into a room, we notice, let's say there's like a tense tone in the room, we're going to adapt because of it, right? Like the whole idea here is that when you pick up on the social cues or the emotions or the mood of those around you, your brain is doing the hard work of figuring out, okay, now how am I going to adapt to not necessarily be like Gumby and contort myself where I totally lose my definition, but also not being like Todd Packer or Michael Scott and steamrolling the tone in the room with your own loud presence. Mm-hmm. You're going to adapt.
Yeah. Yeah, being sensitive to when moments are different than what you expected them to be when you walk in.
So I think maybe to summarize what I hear you saying, Katie, when you're not under-attuned or over-attuned, but appropriately attuned, it is going to inform how you're present.
Yes.
Like if I get home from work today and I notice Josie's tearing up for whatever reason when I walk in the door, under-attuned would be like, I don't even notice that, and go sit down on the couch and go make me a sandwich. I'm just joking. I would never do that. Over-attuned, I don't know. Maybe I would drop everything I'm doing and start crying with her. I don't know.
Demand the kids get out of the room. What's wrong?
Right. But if I notice it, it could be a moment where I'm present and curious and want to know and provide support.
Yeah, I like that. It informs how you're present.
Well, I had fun today. We made a huge jump from self to others. We addressed self-awareness and self-regulation the previous weeks, and today we added the third component of EQ, which is social awareness. And people with high levels of social awareness are appropriately attuned to the people around them, not under-attuned, not over-attuned, but appropriately attuned. And we just named a handful of concrete practices that are helpful in growing your social awareness. So I would just encourage our listeners to pick one and actually practice it over the next few weeks. Try asking good questions. Try summarizing what you hear other people saying. Maybe take an online assessment to get a baseline on how attuned you are to other people's verbal or nonverbal cues, right? But pick one of those practices and really give yourself to it and see what surfaces for you.
Well, thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next time, we plan to continue our series on emotional intelligence by looking at relational management. And while that might initially sound like learning how to manage others better, it's actually about putting together everything we've been discussing in this series to better manage ourselves in relationship with others. So we hope you'll tune in again as we talk about how to manage ourselves effectively in our relationships with others.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.